It's now my great pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues on the board. Julie Norton is a licensed marriage and family therapist and person-centered expressive arts therapist. She is the Behavioral Health Program Manager at Central California Alliance for Health, our local managed Medi-Cal provider. Julie was the Director of Social and Emotional Learning at New Teacher Center and the Director of the Resilience Program at Acknowledge Alliance. Julie has a private practice providing counseling and psychotherapy for youth and adults. Julie approaches her work with compassion, curiosity, playfulness, and depth. Please join me in welcoming Julie to the stage.
Okay, when you have a shorter person up here. Oh, welcome back. What an amazing morning. What an amazing morning. And how incredible for us to have a chance to be here today. It takes a lot to put the time aside, to put the to-do list down. I'm aided by the fact that you don't have internet. But it's hard, it's a crutch. We're used to it, we're comfortable, that's how we communicate. So this afternoon, we get to go into the land a little bit deeper about compassion. And what we've heard again and again is the desire to have some space and time for reflection, and also have a chance to hear some ideas or tips. For me, it's important to start with a land acknowledgement. So I invite each of you to sort of take a deep breath. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsin tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during the Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and to heal from historical trauma. Thank you. So I start today with a story. Well, first I'll just say that I grew up in Santa Cruz. This is my hometown. And it was incredible to be met this morning and surprised right off the bat to see people that I went to school with. Super special. So this is a mosaic from a local school. And I'll start with a story. The one and only time that I've been in a theater performance was when I was in elementary school. I was very nervous, very worried, very uncomfortable, even though my part only had 3 words. 3 words. So I was the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland. I don't know if you remember that the caterpillar's lines repeated again and again. He asks Alice, "Who are you?" And repeats again and again this question of who are you? And as an elementary school student, I didn't get why all the adults were saying that was such an important question. I thought, these are 3 words. But as you heard this morning so much, about sort of who we are and how we are in this world has to do with who am I? So that part has some influence. This morning we had an opportunity to look at the identity map. And in our work with youth, really often they are at a stage of figuring out, who am I? Although loved that I spoke with the 70-some-year-olds who sound like they're still working on that. But what is it that I like? The youth I work with are really trying to figure out those questions like, what am I good at? What matters to me? Where do I fit in? What makes me different? And that question that we also saw this morning about, am I safe? So I invite you, we're gonna start this afternoon's section by taking a few breaths together, and you'll have just a little bit of time to reflect for yourself. For some of you, it won't be that long ago, but to take yourself back to when you were a child or an adolescent. And just give yourself a moment to sort of sit there, take some breaths, bring yourself back. So I ask you to do that because our childhood informs who we are and how we show up in the world. And just following in Mina's path, I want to give you a chance to just connect with somebody next to you. We'll call them an elbow partner. So if you could just have a few minutes with that elbow partner. And if you want some connection questions, it's what do you remember about feeling connected or disconnected? And then the following question, how is being a youth in 2024 same or different? Okay, enjoy a few minutes. So that question around how is it different to be a youth or teen in 2024, you know, the reality is in this current environment, our youth are stressed. They are stressed and feel lonely and isolated and are pressured by tremendous academic stress. In the last year, CDC said that 4 in 10 of our youth were persistently sad or hopeless. Persistently sad or hopeless. They're feeling the weight of the world, where expectations are held either too high or too low, right? Sometimes it can happen both ways. So it's really, important for us to know that this is the state of our youth. I sometimes wonder, how about the state of the adults? How much might this also reflect the stress and anxiety and pressure? How are we doing at modeling the way? Right? Yeah. Is the clapping for paying attention to the adults? Okay. This next artwork is from an organization that lifts up student art. They have a student campaign that's currently open right now, where it invites youth to talk about mental health and to share some information about it. So anxiety is the most common emotion problem in children. We know this. Harvard University Graduate School looked at 61%, this is a little bit older, the 18 to 25-year-olds are lonely all of the time. Oof. What's interesting is that actually maps to the US Surgeon General, who has recently come out with a report about the epidemic of loneliness. So I want you to sort of take a look around in this room and to realize that there are many, I believe the Surgeon General said almost half of the people in here feel like they could use another person in their life to talk to. There's an epidemic of loneliness, and our youth are feeling it even more. The Surgeon General a few years ago did a report looking at how do we protect youth mental health. And what they did was this infographic, which is available online and we can share. And it actually pulls apart these different pieces around the individual impacts of mental health, things like age and genetics, race, ethnicity, disability. So those individual factors. And then you kind of go out a layer, and then it's family. What is the family systems, the relationships with siblings and parents or caregivers, foster parents. The next layer out is community, and that looks at things like peers, teachers, faith communities, and academic pressures. Further out, we look at environment. What's your neighborhood like? How safe is it? What's your access like to food, healthy food, housing, and healthcare? And that last layer out looks at society. What are the social and economic inequalities, the discrimination, the racism, the media, technology, government, popular culture? So the US Surgeon General actually looks at these different elements and then breaks down by, hey, how do we support it? Youth, you're a youth. These are some things we've heard in talking to other teenagers in particular that might help. Like, we know that social media is helpful for you, and we also know that sometimes it's not. And so it actually breaks down suggestions for youth, suggestions for parents, suggestions for teachers, and suggestions for healthcare professionals. The American Psychological Association did this fantastic survey about Generation Z. It's a few years old now, but what we're seeing in the Generation Z population is, unfortunately, it's the group that's the most depressed and has the largest mental health conditions ever. That's the downside. The upside is they're also the most willing to access help, to ask for help. Downside, there's not enough providers. Upside, we have new technology options. There are some mental health platforms. There's some things you'll hear about later in terms of youth supporting youth. So it's important for us to realize what are the circumstances around Generation Z. So this afternoon, we're going to have a chance to dig into the awesome topic of compassion. And we started that this morning, and we're just going to go a little bit deeper. I don't know if you know this, but compassion is actually enshrined as one of the first elements in the American Medical Association's Principles of Medical Ethics. The very first topic. A physician shall be dedicated to providing competent medical services with compassion and respect for human dignity. So this notion of compassion is in all different areas. So we'll be going through these elements in a different way in a little bit. And I wanted to share this again where Mina had talked about these different ways around different elements. There's different social emotional learning frameworks, and this one sort of expands on that. And there's the domain of compassion, self-compassion, compassion for others, and recognizing common humanity. You may know this, but the word compassion stems from the Latin compati, meaning to suffer with. I'm not going to suffer with needing some water. So compassion requires an openness to be with suffering, with also the commitment or desire to provide support and to relieve it. I'm incredibly proud of the work that I did with educators a number of years. The whole concept originally at Acknowledge Alliance was, if you support the teachers, they'll better support the youth. And so it was an incredible chance to get into school systems and actually see how school systems work, and to actually go in and take a peek into what classrooms are looking like these days. How do you look for the evidence of where the relationships are? And one piece, if I could go back and change anything, was a shift from empathy to compassion. Empathy is, putting yourself in someone's shoes. We had Mina sort of outline those different areas and different types of empathy, but often that's the one that people are most familiar with. And too often, that can create a thing of pity, right, where you pity someone. So what we want with compassion, the difference is an openness to provide support, to help relieve suffering. So in that framework, we're going to look at 3 areas: compassion towards oneself, compassion to other people, and compassion towards other living things. Okay, I have a desire. I'd like for everyone who wants to go ahead and stand up. Only if you want to. And if you want to, maybe kind of just, wiggle a little bit. Maybe kind of roll your shoulders. Okay, so if we pay attention to compassion for oneself with paying attention to our bodies, I wanted for us to get up and have a chance for you to check in with your body. Maybe a few more wiggles. Okay. Stay standing, sit back down, whatever you want. So Pema Chodron has this beautiful quote around compassion for others begins with kindness to ourselves. So one of the things that I think is really beautiful, often having compassion for ourselves is actually one of the more challenging places to start, right? It tends to be a little bit easier to have compassion for others. So really part of what we need to do is, how do we strengthen the muscles and strengthen our capacity to have compassion for ourselves? One of the things that I loved seeing and learning and being reminded about is that self-compassion significantly mediated the associations. So those students who had been victims of bullying and had consequently depression afterwards, learning skills and self-compassion was one of the biggest shifts in helping those youth. So if self-compassion can provide that, if it is negatively correlated with depression, we want to help our youth to learn those skills of self-compassion. And again, in that model, to help our youth do that, I believe we need to be better at doing it for ourselves, right? We need to learn, what does that look like? What does that feel like? There's some great work out of Hope Lab, and one of the things I wanted to share with you is that often adults will talk about social media just as the downside, but 43% of youth and social media users say that when they feel depressed, stressed, or anxious, they turn to social media and it helps to make them feel better and more connected. Often we pay attention to the downside. There is downside too, right? There's the possibility of hate speech, body shaming, racism, sexism. But I think it's really important to realize in this digital era that these ways of connecting are real. And if our youth are feeling isolated, then we need to provide the support and realize that these are really big lifelines. Okay. One of the things I like is this concept of turning up the volume of kindness. So one prompt that I was going to ask you to consider just for yourself is my self-compassion is. So think for a moment for yourself. What is your self-compassion? What does it look like? What does it feel like? See what bubbles up. For some of you, self-compassion may have to do with having clearer boundaries with others, or it may have to do with sort of quieting a critical voice. For some of you, it may be noticing when your nervous system gets hijacked. Self-compassion are skills that we learn and practice. I love this notion that compassion takes strength. Those are those muscles that we're flexing and that we're learning. But it also makes strength. So what we do counts. That quote from James Baldwin earlier, thank you. You know, they may not listen, but they certainly are very good at imitating. So you can't talk about this without paying attention to boundaries when you talk about compassion for others, right? Because there's the notion of where am I versus where is somebody else. And so I want to share with you, let's see. Ooh, okay. We have an activity again. Wondering if all of you will join me in rubbing your hands together. Maybe we do a clicks. So I do that as a way to realize, do you hear? Your community is here. We are here and we are together. One of my big things is I look forward to when we really accept that mental health is health, right? It's not something separate. Mental health is health. In that area of compassion for others, I'd love to share a story about a project I was involved in and started in 2017. And appreciated hearing earlier about the origins of some of the SEL work with nonviolence. I was involved in helping with a community project. It was right after the election, and there was a tremendous amount of distress that myself and Christine Evans, also here today, were experiencing from our community. There was just a tremendous disillusionment, I think is the word I would use. Fear, anger, a lot of heightened emotions. And so one of the things that we did, led sort of by Christine's vision, was let's get community together and do what we know how to do, which is to help process emotions in other ways, not just with words, but also with art or art making. Not for creating art, but for the experience of having it get in touch with our feelings. So with that, we created this mosaic tree, which was created by over 180 people. And I show this as an expression of humanity. Each leaf was made by a person who were invited to think about what did they care about most deeply, what did they value, and what did they want to ask for from their leaders. It was beautiful to have conversations from a place of values. What's important to you? Equality, food justice, immigration, clean water. Black Lives Matter. This is one done by a teen around mental health. And one where it was the scales of justice, and then ironically ended up being upside down on the tree. And then the two hands coming together with the hope and a heart at the base that says, "May we all." So one of the incredible things about this project was, again, that holding of common humanity. And to take sort of the suffering and emotions, what was happening at the time, and to have an outlet for it, and to have it result in something beautiful that's now in the community. Happy to say it's at the Resource Center for Nonviolence, and in May we'll be doing an official celebration and dedication. So I'm going to start leading us through an activity that looks at compassion a little bit more. And for some reason, what kept coming up for me over and over and over again was this concept of a compass. So how can we use this model of a compass for compassion? And so I was thinking about maybe the compass is so important because when you think about it, it's around wayfinding. If you're lost, you need help, you want to look where to go, the compass can help guide you. I also think it's a great way of grounding and orienting. Again, kind of lost your place, which way, which direction to go. So the compass is the metaphor, and I'm gonna walk you through each of these different areas of the compass. So the first part of the compass is N for notice. And an element of compassion is definitely around noticing. So earlier I asked you to think about sort of that teenage experience. The first time I was a mental health professional, I was a counselor at a school, and it happened to be a middle school. And I was a few weeks in, I had some amazing students I was working with. I loved the complexity of the school system, and somehow I just was like, I found my place. But I had this like jittery feeling all the time, like anxious, jittery feeling all the time. And I was noticing in my body. So I had sort of some awareness that was going on. I had the great help of a clinical supervisor who asked me, what was your middle school experience like? Guess what? That jittery, anxious feeling, that was my middle school experience, right? So it's sort of these moments in time where we get to see sort of where we bring things back to. But one of the things that's so powerful is how do we notice without judgment? Earlier, there was the notion of sharing sort of a rhythmic breathing practice. So one mechanism of how to do that is sort of a noticing, like using our breath to help arrive and to tend to. If we move on and we look towards E, it's on emotional resonance. And to me, emotional resonance is that sensitivity to those micro things. A little bit later, still while I was an intern before being licensed, I had this story shared with me around attunement and emotional resonance, and I'd like to share it with you. This is from Piero Ferrucci, The Power of Kindness, the unexpected benefits of leading a compassionate life. Although I'm not a musician, I once had the opportunity to hold in my hands an exquisitely made violin, dating back to the 18th century. What amazed me even more than its harmonious lines or the beautiful grain of its wood was holding it. I could feel it vibrate. It was not an inert object. It resonated with the various sounds that happened to resonate with things around it. Another violin, a human voice. If you hold an ordinary factory-made violin, it just doesn't happen. There can be hundreds of sounds around it, and the violin remains quiet. In order to obtain the fine sensitivity and extraordinary resonance of the old violin, the makers had to have an exceptional knowledge of wood and its seasonings. They were supported by the artisan tradition of generations, and they were endowed with the talent of cutting the wood and furnishing the instrument. The marvelous responsiveness is an active virtue. It's the capacity of the violin to enter into resonance, and it goes in hand with its capacity to create sound of extraordinary quality. Music was soul, able to move and to inspire. We humans, or at least can be, like that violin. Since birth, we have been given the ability to resonate with other human beings. A newborn cries when in the presence of other crying babies. Bit by bit, empathy, which at first is only simple instinctual capacity to resonate, develops and becomes the capacity to understand other people's feelings and at points of view to identify with them. The story goes on, but it ends with this. We are all fragile. Sooner or later, we are all sick, make mistakes, fail, are disappointed in what life brings, or we lose a person we love. We all suffer. And we have come to terms with our suffering. The best way to face pain is directly, with sincerity and courage, to enter into it and then to come out the other side. If I deny my suffering, it's hard for me to identify with the pain of others. My own suffering is the grounds for compassion. So with that, I'm going to share a piece of music. And there are a number of you here today who work for County Behavioral Health. And this is music by the wonderful Joanna Moody. And it was a piece of music that she created after she first started working with clients. So I invite you to listen to this piece of music and see if these words talk to you at all.
May I see you, may I hear gently in my hand. Will you trust me? Will you let me? Will you open up your door? Will you tell, will you tell, will you tell a story you never told before? And I know you've got your secrets, and I know you don't want to be alone. May I see you, may I hear you, may I walk your spirit home. All the ramparts we've been building to protect ourselves from pain. Will we dare, will we dare, will we dare to soften and risk ourselves again? All the structures I've been building to help us heal and grow, will they stand, will they stand, will they stand the moment you let your feelings show? And I know you've got your secrets, and I know you don't want to be alone. May I see you, may I hear you, may I walk your spirit home. Will you trust me? Will you let me? Will you open up your door? Will you tell, will you tell, will you tell a story you never told before? And yes, we've all got our secrets, and no, we don't want to be alone. May I see you, may I hear you, may I walk your spirit home.
Yay, Joanna. So my invitation to you is to each be that fine violin, to feel the resonance, and to also be aware of when others are resonating or supporting you. Somehow that metaphor of the violin is one that has stuck with me, because I've noticed when there's that attunement with another person, either somebody supporting me or me supporting them, it definitely promotes connection and trust. And then there's just a sense of being understood and being less alone. So our S is for sameness. And here we look at how we are all deeply flawed. We all suffer. There's a grieving process. And that even with the depression and anxiety we're experiencing in our youth, like knowing that there's the sameness with it. And W having to do with being with, sitting with our own pain, uncomfortable feelings. We have to do our own work. So I was lucky enough to also do work in grief therapy. And often when you're working with somebody after there's been a death, either natural death or a tragedy or something complicated, grief. The notion is, how do we sit still? How do we drop in? How do we listen deeper, like we heard Mina talking about? And to really be with that suffering. How do we learn to tolerate those uncomfortable feelings? And when we do, that we can help those that we work with, kids, youth, to also tolerate uncomfortable feelings. I don't know about you, I'm still working on that. So I said I'd give you a specific practice, and this is something that comes from Paul Gilbert. And Paul Gilbert is the original founder of compassion-focused therapy. He's done tremendous amount of research with colleagues and peers, and created the Compassion Mind Foundation. He's also part of the Wright Institute in some of their research groups. And this is a simple practice that I think is quite a powerful one. So again, kind of invite you, this is a practice that you can either do seated or standing, but I'd love to walk you through a very simple activity. So those of you who want to stand, feel comfortable to, and those of you who want to stay seated, you're welcome. So these are called the building blocks for the compassion itself, and they involve 3 different parts. The first is posture, the second is facial expression, and the third is voice tones. So when we feel threatened, our body takes up a defensive posture. If we're angry or irritated, we feel that tension around our chest area. Anxious or worried, we tend to curve our shoulders inward, as if we're protecting the body. So this practice is simple. What is it like if you gently lift your shoulders up, slightly move them back and down? So lifting the shoulders up, back, and down. And just noticing those little micro differences of how does it feel when your heart is open and expanded. So shoulders up, back, and down. Might seem like a simple thing, but it's just, again, that noticing. How do I notice when I'm curled forward versus when I'm opening up? When am I trying to protect my body? And when can I feel slightly different? So again, the invitation to gently lift and roll back slightly. See if there's any difference when you do that. Next is facial expression. And again, we're doing an activity with really subtle changes. So the facial expressions are connected to different areas of the brain, which give feedback to the brain on mental states, and deliberately create certain facial expressions can actually stimulate emotion centers in our brain, even if it's artificial. So we're gonna practice this, and the whole notion that you're gonna go is you're gonna start with a neutral facial expression, and then after 15 seconds, I'm gonna invite you to create a friendly face. And with that friendly face, I want you to imagine you're greeting somebody that you really like. Maybe it's a friend, so there's affection, but notice that difference. So starting again with neutral, and then we'll shift. So just give yourself some time to be in sort of a neutral face. And now change that expression, slight smile, the feeling of seeing a friend. And then back to neutral. So the activity can be simple, playing with these ideas of posture and facial expressions. Okay, next is tone of voice. How about those times when maybe your middle name was used? Okay, with tone of voice, the practice is thinking about, again, sort of a really neutral tone of voice versus one where there's warmth and affection. And so we're not going to say this out loud, but I'd like you to imagine, my name's Julie, so I'm going to be like, hi, Julie, in a neutral tone of voice. So in my head, I'm thinking, hi, Julie. And then the alternative to that is with sort of warmth and affection. I'm like, hi, Julie. So there might be sort of a change in pitch. And I believe you can actually practice this in your mind. So start with neutral, saying hello to yourself, and then shift and see if there's a difference between neutral and warmth and affectionate. I was surprised when I did this, the difference a tone of voice can make. So there are beautiful meditation practices, or I don't know if meditation practice is really the right words, but these types of things where how do we be with difficult emotions, either ours or somebody else? And while these three little things seem really basic, these micro practices can make a difference. And it makes a difference because we're able to stay in our own equanimity. So the next time you're really struggling with being with hard feelings or tolerating those things, the invitation would be play with that. Do you notice any difference in terms of shifting your posture slightly, to shifting your expression slightly, and to making changes with your tone of voice? So back to our compass, we've got these different areas of notice, emotional resonance, sameness, and to be with, tolerating those difficult feelings. So how can we talk about compassion without talking about compassion fatigue? Okay, how many of you are familiar with that term? A lot of you. So in the beginning, I shared with you, if I could turn back time, I would spend less energy on empathy and more on compassion, because compassion, we keep the equanimity of ourself, and we also have the ability to shift and desire to remove suffering. So I would say to you, I do not believe that the term is compassion fatigue, because with compassion, you are able to stay sort of in a place where you're less in somebody else's space. So I actually believe that it's not compassion fatigue, but empathy fatigue. That there's an exhaustion when you're always putting yourself in someone's shoes. And instead, the idea is, how do we use our compassion for thoughtful action? Because compassion is not just the softness, the kindness. It's also the knowledge of how do I make an action. Even if that action is deep, intense, reflective, thoughtful thinking. So as we sort of bring this back to the home stretch, I want to bridge it back to belonging. Compassion is a strategic response to isolating and othering. And when you think about that notion of belonging, my hope is that we can really use the skills and practices of compassion, strengthen them for ourselves, and in our practice and connection, help each other out of this epidemic of isolation. We are here in community. Really invite you to connect and appreciate, to tell those vulnerable stories when you feel safe. And then in doing so, we really have an opportunity to connect with each other and to provide some lessening of suffering. So appreciate your time.